Welcome everybody to our webinar today on coordinating energy efficiency and demand response, EM&V or evaluation, measurement, and verification among Western state agencies. My name is Steve Schiller. I'm with Lawrence Berkeley National Lab. I'm Senior Advisor here, and I'll be facilitating our webinar today as well as making some of the presentations. Let me just first introduce the co-sponsors of our webinar today. We have Lawrence Berkeley National Lab, which is operated by the University of California for the U.S. Department of Energy. In the context of the webinar today, LBNL provides technical support for states on energy issues, mostly state energy offices, regulators, and air offices, intending to provide technical and biased input. A link with information on this technical assistance, which is available to states, is indicated on our last slide today. The other organization co-sponsoring today is the Western Interstate Energy Board, or WIEB, which is an organization of 11 Western states and 3 Western Canadian provinces, which happen to be associate members of the board. The board promotes energy policy that is developed cooperatively among the member states and provides information that support those states working among themselves and with the federal government. And then, of course, at the bottom here we have our standard disclaimer saying that all of these co-sponsors are not responsible for the content, merely the speakers speaking for themselves. So with that, let me tell you what we're going to be doing today on this webinar for about 75 minutes. The intent here is to, first of all, introduce the concept we have of EM&V coordination and what are the benefits and why this might be relevant for you. To that, we're going to have a user or participant panel, as we're calling it. We have 4 folks from different state organizations going to be talking about their EM&V activities and why this coordination could possibly be valuable for them. They'll briefly go through that after I do the introduction portion. And also going to talk about some coordination examples in place, both within the region, at least the Northwest, and also national efforts as well. And then we'll be concluding with a representative from WIEB, Elaine Ginocchio, is going to be talking about next steps and how you can participate if you're interested, and then we'll have Q&A with the panelists. I do want to mention, as shown in the green box on the slide here, that the webinar is being recorded and it'll be posted on the WIEB website. We'll send out a notice to all those who were registered for the webinars to its location. It'll probably be within a day or so. Also, because of the large number of participants we have on the webinar today, all of you as attendees are in mute mode. But if you'd like to use the chat box to send us your questions or comments anytime during the webinar, please do that. And you can just type that into the chat box that hopefully you see on the bottom left-hand corner. We have a number of speakers today. Again, myself, Steve Schiller with LBNL, and also Lisa Schwartz, and then the regional organization representatives that I mentioned a little bit ago to talk about their efforts in the regional, and then Elaine Ginocchio from WIEB. I will do introductions of each of these folks as they begin. And on that, let me first start off by introducing Lisa Schwartz, who is with LBNL. She leads the energy efficiency team here and works in the electricity markets and policy group. Before joining the lab, most appropriately for this talk today, she was the director of the Oregon Department of Energy. And earlier she led Oregon Public Utility Commission work on resource planning and procurement. So with that, Lisa, if you could give us some background.
Thanks, Steve. Good morning. About a year ago, the Western Interstate Energy Board asked Lawrence Berkeley National Lab for some technical help to explore potential multi-state coordination on evaluation, measurement, and verification for energy efficiency. And then since then, we've also begun to talk about demand response as well. We worked together to prepare an outline for a brief, and there's a link up on the slide. It's about the different products and approaches that you could use for states that would like to consider working together, as well as regional agencies, whether it's just energy efficiency or also looking at demand response and potentially how those programs could work with pollution prevention. So since we published that brief in spring with funding from our sponsor, U.S. Department of Energy, we followed up with WIEB staff as well as a slew of Western states, one-on-one conversations with people at state energy offices, public utility commissions, and air quality regulators to find out what they thought about this potential coordination. And we got enough interest to move forward with this webinar today and explore with our speakers some of the concepts that we presented to the broader audience and discuss potential next steps.
Okay, great. Thank you, Lisa. So with a little bit of that background here, I want to go and talk a little bit about EM&V and this concepts of coordination here. So first, just a real quick do an introduction to EM&V. Let me mention the perhaps somewhat obvious that EM&V stands for Evaluation, Measurement, and Verification. And it's about documenting the impacts of policies, programs, or projects, in this case, energy efficiency or demand response activities, programs, projects, etc. Essentially, EM&V lets you know what happened and why, and can provide information for improving future programs as well. The whole idea here is that things that are measured tend to improve. And so EM&V can also be used for projecting future impacts, such as the potential for efficiency and DR. And so that's the EM&V we're going to be talking about today. So when we're talking about coordination, what is meant is effective interactions, essentially, among the public agencies and other organizations that are working with these state agencies, covering the EM&V of energy efficiency and demand response activities. The types of agencies that might be involved in such coordination are state PUCs, energy offices, air regulators, potentially local agencies involved with regional activities, perhaps something relating to the Clean Power Plan or other regional, city, local, state initiatives. And then, of course, regional organizations that already exist or could exist to promote energy efficiency and demand response, or at least the best performance of those. Our sense is that, among the Western states, the coordination of EM&V could really facilitate and improve the quality of EM&V by having these discussions around things such as benchmarking of performance, disclosure of information, tracking of efficiency and demand response projects, there's savings that come from that, and really trying to improve the consistency and the quality of the procedures, and having that can benefit all those involved, whether it's the regulators and the energy offices, down to the contractors and even the participants in these programs who see and have greater confidence in the EM&V and have a consistent way in which they report, not separate mechanisms. It also potentially could support trading of efficiency credits if they're used for pollution reduction programs or other regulations. And also the coordination could reduce development costs associated with EM&V, as different agencies can share the costs among them if they're coming up with similar products. All of this, of course, then associated with trying to have greater impacts, more efficacy working with the energy efficiency and demand response programs. As Lisa mentioned, there was a report prepared, and in that report we identified 3 coordination options. The first, and sort of as a hint to the rest of this presentation, this clearinghouse or exchange is one that we're recommending be further evaluated and perhaps be developed for the region. And this is a relatively low level of coordination. It's really about sharing information among those who are interested on a voluntary basis to look at the various experiences and expertise that they have, the products they develop, and sharing that information for mutual benefit. Another level of coordination could be the actual development of EM&V products. Again, this would be voluntary, looking at preparing certain products, and I have a list of some of the possible ones in the next slide. And then the third option that was identified was actually developing a regional tracking system for energy efficiency and or demand response activities. And this would be by the interested states or perhaps a regional entity that administers such a registry, and that could be used for supporting compliance with state or regional or federal programs around, say, pollution prevention, with the example of the Clean Power Plan, or just disclosure and benchmarking of various activities relating to EE and DR. As I mentioned, one of the opportunities for coordination might be developing products among the Western states. So one thing you could do is a standard reporting format so that those who are implementing these programs, administering these programs, primarily utilities, but in some cases other organizations such as Energy Trust of Oregon, could have a consistent reporting within their state or the region. This might be particularly valuable for utilities that have operations in multiple states. You could have a regional database of consistent values for deemed savings. These are known as technical reference manuals, and many of the states in the region have them, but there's not necessarily consistency among them, or even just consistency among the definitions and concepts, standardized EM&V plans, or perhaps even something around professional standards, minimum requirements for those who are implementing the EM&V. And these are all examples just of products that the states working together in some manner of coordination could be developing. So as I hinted a few slides back, our suggested step here at this time is looking at developing the regional EM&V clearinghouse. And the real focus of this is on sharing information. Not necessarily developing products, although that could be something that if participants in this are interested in, they could do. But again, it's sharing information, such as the documents and the approaches, the experiences that you all on this call and others have to help support. It could, though, also be a springboard for these other levels of coordination for those who are interested. Just on one call we had the other day, the couple of the people, as we were preparing for this webinar, were talking about electric vehicles and mechanisms for how to document the impacts of those on the grid. And these are kind of things we're talking among colleagues in other states. You might be able to identify areas where you can work on things together, or at least to share that experience. Again, some of the examples of information that could be shared, I've gone through some of these before, but just having a listing here. This is probably a good point to mention again that this webinar is being recorded, and the recording as well as the slides will be available for you to review later. And we'll send out the link for where that's located on the web to those who have signed up today. So we have EM&V methodologies, different approaches that you've used for particular program types or measure types, down to just a glossary of common terms and case studies, as well as just the contact information for folks in other agencies across the region that if you're wondering if someone else has worked on such and such thing, that you would know who to contact in that agency. In terms of formats for how this could be set up, perhaps the most obvious is there could be a website with either public access or password protected information available for sharing of this information. We could have webinars or workshops, potentially even in-person conferences where there could be informal or formal presentation information, and just other ways of just doing networking through information or technical assistance, making some experts perhaps available to the group, or just this general category of meetups to have opportunities for people to informally get together and talk about EM&V topics, efficiency, demand response, and really even broader into the whole demand side management areas. And so, it's really the opportunity here for folks to get together and discuss these things, whether it's developing information or perhaps even, as I see one comment just came in, the idea of working together and coordinating on major studies associated, say, with potential or assessing technologies so that individual states don't need to do that on their own. I do want to mention is that we've titled this Western coordination, and so I wanted to put up at least one slide that defines what we're talking about for the West. These are the states in the WIEB organization, but there's no particular reason why the region couldn't be defined differently, include other states, whether it's Hawaii, and maybe we could even ask our friends in Montana if they would allow the North Dakotans to participate. That's my one Montana, North Dakota joke for the day here, okay. And I want to conclude my introduction to this here with just a few notes as I've been talking about all the potential benefits that could come from this coordination. Of course, we recognize that there are some considerations we should take into account where the way I simply put it, making sure that the effort or the pain is worth the gain. And we do know, in working any type of regional or any type of coordination effort among different parties, you have some potential on a generalized basis of losing some control or getting to a lowest common denominator, products or services that just meet minimum requirements, or even just having costs associated with the coordination that add inefficiencies versus addressing inefficiencies in the system. And then specifically for the clearinghouse, it's less so of these potential risks because we're really just looking at more simple information sharing on a voluntary basis. But of course, there would be some time involved in this. So I want to mention these just to be realistic about things that we need to consider. And the way I look at it is that in any activity, there's going to be potential things to consider, potential risk. And if you acknowledge and are aware of these potential disadvantages, they all can be mitigated. And so we'll pay attention to that as we talk about setting up the structures for these coordination if it does happen. So with that introduction, next up in the webinar, we have our user participant panel with 4 folks, and I'll introduce them in a second, and then go over some of these regional and national EM&V coordination examples, and then proceed to next steps with Elaine and a Q&A time for those who are interested in asking specific questions. On that, I do want to mention again that we have a text box that if folks have questions or comments, please type them in there at any time, and we will do our best to respond to them. I saw one that came up already was about how the Regional Technical Forum of the Northwest Power and Conservation Council could fit into this. I think they are a resource, and we actually have a speaker, Tina Jarawara, who's going to talk a little bit about the RTF, the Regional Technical Forum, as a possible model and resource for these activities. So with that, let me turn to our user participant panel. These folks are just going to talk for a few minutes each about their experiences. And let me just introduce them, and then they'll in turn speak here. So first is Deborah Reynolds. She is the Assistant Director of Conservation and Energy Planning at the Washington Utilities and Transportation Commission. During her time with the Commission, she led the development of the Commission's first sustainability plan, as well as developed the first ever evaluation, measurement, and verification framework for the Washington IOUs. She also developed a brand new section of an analyst working on energy efficiency and integrated resource planning issues. Next up will be Stacy Donahue, who has been the lead staff person for DSM issues of the Idaho Public Utilities Commission. In that role, she's written the staff positions on integrated resource plans, fixed cost recovery and decoupling mechanisms, as well as energy efficiency and demand response program design and cost recovery. And also prior to the time at the Idaho PUC, she worked at the Idaho Governor's Office of Energy Resources, also working on efficiency as well as renewable projects. Next, for a perspective from an air regulator, we have Cameron Kahn, who works with the Arizona Department of Environmental Quality as an environmental engineering specialist. He currently works in the Air Quality Improvement Planning section and is the technical lead for the implementation of the Clean Power Plan in Arizona. And then last but certainly not least is John Gooden of the California Independent System Operator. He's their regulatory policy manager in the Market and Infrastructure Policy Group. John was actually part of the the Cal ISO startup team back in 1997 when he was, I believe, 2 years old. And John led the development of the ISO's current demand response policies and programs and continues to support distributed energy resource policy development, resource adequacy, and all other policy efforts that affect market design and infrastructure policy concerns. So with those intros, Deborah, you could start off with some comments for us.
Thank you, Steve. Good morning. I'm, as you said, Deborah Reynolds, the Assistant Director of Conservation and Energy Planning with the Washington Utilities and Transportation Commission. And also, as you mentioned, I do lead a small group of analysts, and we work on energy efficiency and long-range planning for the 3 investor-owned utilities in Washington. That's Puget Sound Energy, Avista Corporation, and Pacific Power. So we require our companies to work with stakeholder advisory groups to develop EM&V frameworks that guide their energy efficiency work throughout the year. We also incorporate a requirement for third-party EM&V, and we did this in our rulemaking last year. We use the information from these reports to reach recommendations about whether or not companies have met their energy efficiency targets. And companies can be penalized if they miss them, so this is a big deal. We also use this information to help us assess the adaptive management practices required of the companies. The most significant information gap we face in Washington is the need to apply EM&V to demand response programs. We haven't done that at all in the Northwest, and we're looking for guidance. We are also closely watching the development of EM&V 2.0, or real-time measurement. It does look like this will be the next iteration of EM&V, and we need to figure out how to work with it. We are very lucky in the Northwest, as you mentioned, to have the Northwest Power and Conservation Council's Regional Technical Forum. They gather together industry expertise and EM&V results to develop shared savings estimates and savings protocols. Probably the best example of sharing information I can think of is the lighting savings estimates that the Regional Technical Forum has developed for the Northwest using data from a variety of sources, including California. Thank you, Fred Gordon. As we continue to move through the federal lighting standard phases, we need to adjust our savings estimates for both potential savings looking ahead and achieved savings looking back. The shared studies provided by the participants in the RTF and the expert review that follows results in savings estimates that are reliable, consistent, and conservative. And the use of this shared information, most importantly for me as a regulator, is that it significantly reduces the regulatory burden on Commission staff. We spend far less time than we otherwise would. I just want to say I do believe the National Clearinghouse of Energy Efficiency, EM&V, would be hugely valuable. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Deborah, for providing that perspective. Stacy?
Hi, everybody. My name is Stacy Donahue. Steve, thanks for organizing this and the invitation to speak. I work at the Idaho Public Utilities Commission. I'm a utilities analyst focused primarily on DSM and also integrated resource planning and renewables. So at the Idaho Commission, I guess I'll explain how we've used EM&V for energy efficiency here. The utilities are responsible for hiring their own EM&V consultants to evaluate their programs and provide those reports to the Commission staff usually, well, either when they're available or in the context of a prudency review when utilities are asking for recovery of their energy efficiency rider funds. And so the small dedicated staff at the PUC reviews those evaluations. And that's not bad, and in many cases it works really well. It's not perfect though. I would say that the Idaho Commission, that just reviewing individual evaluations tends to give us a little bit of a narrow focus on what happened in those reports. It doesn't necessarily, those reports and programs, it doesn't necessarily put it into a broader context of what's going on nationally and regionally. So for us, it would be really useful to have a clearinghouse where there is an easy place to compare outcomes, savings, and best practices, both for evaluation methods and for implementation methods. And so that's kind of the main thrust of how a clearinghouse might be able to help us over here. I'm kind of commenting on the clearinghouse rather than some of the product options or more advanced and detailed proposals, just because it's probably the easiest to implement, and it would certainly provide, a significant amount of value to us. Of course, there are concerns with the clearinghouse: who manages it, who updates it, who funds it, how it would weave in and complement other attempts at regional collaboration, like, for instance, what Deborah mentioned with the RTF and a lot of NIA's work. So that would need to be thought through. Certainly we already have time and staff and budget constraints, so it wouldn't be something that the Idaho Commission could probably give a lot into, but we would certainly benefit from it if it existed. And that's, I think that's the extent of my comments.
Great. Thanks so much. Cameron, do you want to talk a little bit about your perspective on this?
Sure. So here at ADQ, our EMV need comes from the Clean Power Plan. So as an air regulator, quantifying emissions from stacks is our area of expertise. And from a high level, that's what the MAS plan entails. However, currently Arizona is leaning toward more of a rate-based plan. And a large portion of that is, verifying electricity savings, which is quite a bit outside of our wheelhouse. And sure, EPA is going to be putting out guidances on EM&V. My fear is these guidances are going to be static and will likely just refer to whatever the industry practice is currently. And that's the crux of what would make a clearinghouse valuable to ADQ. It would be great to have a resource like the clearinghouse that I could go to and learn what the current industry practice is, so I could have an educated conversation with our stakeholders and whoever we contract to run the ERC desk. And it would be nice to know what other states are doing as far as ERC desks, and maybe some coordination there, or the clearinghouse could be a platform for that discussion. So that's where I see the value for ADQ.
Great. Thank you, Cameron. I really appreciate that. And then John from CalISO.
Yeah, thanks, Steve, and good morning, everyone. A couple of things I want to talk about today is basically where we are today, and then why I think it would be really helpful to have this clearinghouse and really consistent EM&V protocols, particularly around demand response. But first, as Steve said, I'm in our market and infrastructure policy group. That's where we do most of the market design work for the independent system operator here in California, a lot of that policy around the market design. And the ISO has actually been engaged in really trying to incorporate demand response into its markets since around 2007, 2008, and we finally had our first product approved called Proxy Demand Resource by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission in 2010. And so the ISO, like the other ISOs and regional transmission operators in the country, we financially settle with DR providers for the energy services that they provide the market. And demand response, just like a generator can sell energy into the ISO, balancing energy, they can provide ancillary services to the ISO. So the whole suite or panoply of energy services that the ISO procures and settles, demand response can do the same here in our market. So as far as really providing performance evaluation methods that are appropriate for the different resource types is very critical, because we're ultimately an ISO or RTO are transacting with other people's money. We're taking money from here and paying it over there. And so our participants and our market participants really need faith and confidence in the accuracy and precision of the methods that we employ. So that's a little background. As far as where we are today, like I said, FERC approved our Proxy Demand Resource product in 2010. That particular product uses a 10 of 10 with a 20% adjustment factor baseline method, so it uses historic days to determine performance of the actual event day. And this 10 and 10 baseline with this adjustment factor is generally proven to be a good fit for medium and large commercial customers and industrial customers, but it's generally less accurate for like small commercial and residential AC cycling, agricultural customers. And yet those other types of customers, like residential AC cycling, for example, are a big part of the demand response market. And so we really had this gap in our measurement and verification protocols for demand response, to where we could generally settle fairly accurately these larger commercial and industrial customers, but our method that FERC had approved was lacking. So that really led us to down this path of establishing a working group here this year, actually in 2016. We've been talking about it for quite some time, but this year we established a baseline analysis working group to explore new performance evaluation methods that we can apply to other applications like residential AC cycling or small commercial or agricultural customers. And so the baseline working group has gone about and leveraged a lot of existing research, and in fact the group has performed its own research and analytics. We've hired Nexent, actually the utilities hired Nexent to do some additional work for us to propose really a suite of new performance evaluation methods and their application in the ISO market. The ISO will then take the findings of this working group and then build these new performance evaluations methods into our tariff. So that working group is ongoing. It's close to finalizing its work product, and so we're seeing the fruits of that labor. But that kind of gets me to my final point I want to make is why this clearinghouse would be so important and why we ultimately support this. It really stems from this exercise we've gone through this past year where, you know, it seems like whenever you're going to do EM&V for like demand response or energy efficiency, it's kind of like you start from scratch every time. You go and you do your research, you dig through and leverage other people's work, their memories, their experiences, but there's no like central repository or warehouse for this information, and so it takes a lot of effort. Every time you want to go down this path, you got to kind of reinvent the wheel. And so our perspective is that if we would have had this warehouse, you know, a lot of the efforts that we've spent was just doing additional research, digging through a lot of the literature that exists out there, and then trying to apply that to our situation. So we think that there could be a lot of efficiency gained if that data and information was warehoused, including sort of like what Steve was talking about. How could we make this useful in a way that you can quickly get to the information you need? Load data would be awesome to have in this warehouse that you could use to sample different kind of baselines and applications, best practices, what methods work best for what type of resources and in what applications. And then the human resources. Who are the people out there that can help solve some of these issues? So I see the clearinghouse more than just these EM&V, but it can be in many things: load data, human resource contacts, things like that could be really helpful and save us a lot of time and money. So I think this is all just concluding here. I think this is really important, particularly as demand response and energy efficiency are seen as sort of go-to resources as we move to sort of the clean energy economy. And I think that if we had consistent methodologies as applied to different customer classes, as much as that is sort of something we would aspire to, could be very helpful, because as this market develops and there's more demand response and DER providers out there, consistent methodologies in the West and perhaps even throughout the nation would be very helpful and would really reduce a lot of their sort of upfront and operational costs. So that concludes my remarks there, Steve.
Great. Thank you, John. And also thanks for providing the background about what's happening with demand response programs at the Cal ISO. I also want to thank Deborah and Stacy and Cameron as well for providing those perspectives. I know actually, again, for me that's helpful as we think through how a clearinghouse would work and what the objectives are, but also hopefully provided for our audience here, you on the webinar, just some ideas and create some thoughts in your minds about how such a clearinghouse could possibly be helpful for your interest, improve your work, save you some time, save some money as well. So again, I want to thank our panelists there for that background on perspectives. So with that, I want to next turn to what are some examples of how this coordination has worked, starting with the Northwest Regional Technical Forum that I mentioned earlier. And then I'll also mention some other efforts that are going around on a national basis that could represent, both examples as well as, efforts that such a coordination effort here in the West could benefit from and participate in. So for that, we're going to start with Tina Diawara, who is a senior analyst at the Northwest Power and Conservation Council. At the Council, Tina works primarily on energy efficiency issues as part of the development and implementation of the Council's regional power plan. She's also involved in furthering development and demand response in the region. So just want to mention, prior to joining the Council, she was the principal in the Energy Service Division and the head of planning and assessment team for the Cadmus Group, a consulting firm, and has had the opportunity to work not only in the Northwest on these related issues, but nationally. So with that, Tina, I think you have control. You can get to your next slide there, your first slide. There we go. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Steve. So a few of the speakers, including Steve, have mentioned the Regional Technical Forum, or the RTF, so I'm just going to spend a few slides kind of describing what we are and what we do and how it provides some of this value. I've already talked about that the sort of a regional coordination. So before I get too much into what the RTF is, I think providing a little context of how it came to be would be helpful. So the Northwest, in our view, are the 4 states here in this diagram: Washington, Oregon, Idaho, and western Montana. And the reason why we work within these 4 states is that we're all connected through this Columbia River basin. So we have the Columbia River and the Snake River as the 2 main rivers around this area. And as you can see in the slide, there's a number of hydroelectric dams that are sited along the rivers. And the power from these dams is managed and marketed by the Bonneville Power Administration, and the power from the dams then primarily goes to the public utilities in the region. So about half of our regional power comes from the hydroelectric dams. The Northwest Power and Conservation Council was formed by an act of Congress in 1980, the Northwest Power Act, and our job is to help ensure the long-term, affordable, and reliable power system that comes from primarily from these dams for this region. And we do these long-range power plans, and from these power plans we have, for the last 35 years that we've been doing these, found that energy efficiency is the primary resource needed for the region. So because there's a lot of emphasis on energy efficiency in the region, and Bonneville has an obligation to acquire that EE, we've kind of developed a regional push towards acquiring energy efficiency. So the RTF was formed in the late 90s, 1999, by the Council from a request of Congress. And it was done because, for the prior 15 or so years, utilities were doing energy efficiency, but there wasn't a lot of consistency or necessarily rigor around how that EE was being counted and acquired. And so the RTF was formed as a means to help ensure reliable energy savings coming from all these programs. And there's the RTF is funded by the regional utilities and from the Bonneville Power Administration. We appoint about 30 members who are selected based on technical expertise, and we have members from utilities, from EM&V consultants, from national labs. So we try to get a wide variety to all kind of bring their expertise together to further the understanding of energy efficiency in the region. But I should note we don't have any regulatory authority. That's, Stacy and Deborah from Washington can use the RTF in their regulatory means, but the RTF itself does not have any sort of authority. So the RTF reports to the Council and the chair of the Council, but really we work for the region. So the utilities, any of those who implement the programs, and the regulators sort of rely on the RTF to help further energy efficiency. So basically what the RTF role and goal is we kind of touch upon these different means of acquiring savings through program delivery. What Steve was earlier talking about, the EM&V products, is what we focus on primarily. So our focus, and I should mention, our focus has historically been in energy efficiency. Demand response is starting to garner more interest in the region, and one of the things the RTF is exploring is what kind of value it could provide in the DR frame within its charter and all the other contexts. But there may be some role of the RTF in DR going forward, but historically it's been around energy efficiency. So we have the primary focus is on these unit energy savings, which some people call deemed savings, and that's where a lot of the energy goes into. But we also, as you can see, provide guidance on program impact evaluation. And again, the goal of the RTF is to make sure energy efficiency is of a high reliability when it's acquired through the programs. And the hope is that through the work of the RTF, it eases the burden for the utilities in delivering the programs and doing their own evaluation, as well as Deborah mentioned earlier, hopefully eases the regulatory burden for the states across the region. So I think the main value that the RTF offers is because all the processes are open. The website includes all the information that's used to come up with these unit energy savings. The guidance documents are all posted on the website. We have as I mentioned, a 30-member panel, and so we get a lot of different perspectives to review the work that's done. We have subcommittees that kind of get together, and others from outside the membership could participate in these subcommittees to make sure that we have a lot of eyes on it and we have high quality. And finally, because we're a regional organization, we have some economies of scale. We do sometimes have struggles through intra-regional differences, but I think in general we are able to satisfy, on average, the region as a whole, and to help avoid duplication and find synergies amongst the different parties that are delivering and evaluating energy efficiency. And as you can see also on the slide, that we have a lot of stakeholders that use the RTF work in many different ways. So with that, I will finish up. And if you have questions, you could reach out to me, or Jennifer Light is our RTF manager, and she really ought to be presenting now, but she's actually chairing one of our monthly RTF meetings right now, so she wasn't able to be here today. But check out the website, contact either of us, and we're happy to answer more questions through this presentation.
Great. Thank you very much, Tina. We did get in a question around, if you could talk for a moment about the committee structure that you have with the RTF and how the stakeholders participate, how people can participate in the RTF. Let me just mention with that question, just a reminder to our audience that if you have other questions, please feel free to type them into the chat box, and we'll try to get to them in the Q&A period coming up shortly.
Sure. As I said, Jennifer currently is chairing our RTF meeting. Right now we have those meetings monthly, and that's when as much as the entire body of the RTF comes together, we also have corresponding members or other interested parties that could attend these monthly meetings, where the focus is on the agenda that's posted about a week before each meeting. So anybody could come to those meetings, ask questions to the contract analysts that are presenting. And then we have, as I mentioned, the question was about these subcommittees. So again, on the RTF website is a list of all the subcommittees that are currently active. I think there's maybe 7 or 8 of them, maybe 10. And the subcommittees meet to, for example, we have a research and evaluation subcommittee. So when the RTF is looking at whether we could come up with proven savings for a unit energy savings measure, we might say, well, we're not quite there yet. We don't have enough data to call this proven, which is sort of the highest standard of what the savings are. But if some regional bodies, utilities or other stakeholders can do an evaluation or do some research in this way, this will help our understanding of the savings. So the R&E, the Research and Evaluation Subcommittee, will kind of think about what the best types of activities are needed in order to further that measures, understandings, or whatever it is. The subcommittees, as I mentioned, they're all posted on the website, and you could reach out to Jen or to Garrett, who's the RTF assistant, and request to be put on the mailing list. And so as subcommittees are meeting, as materials are being posted, you will be aware of that, and then you could participate in it. So it's not restricted to memberships. Really, memberships can vote on whether approving a measure savings or not, but in terms of being active in the process, it's open to interested parties.
Great. Thank you very much, Tina. So with that, I'm going to pretty quickly, and this is Steve Schiller again from Lawrence Berkeley National Lab, I'm going to pretty quickly go through some other examples of activities around the country. 4 of them here that I was thinking would be informative as examples. The first one I want to mention is the EM&V Form, which is an organization operating in the Northeast and Mid-Atlantic of our country. The forum is facilitated by the Northeast Energy Efficiency Partnership, which is a nonprofit group that operates a number of efficiency initiatives in that region. The EM&V Form itself covers 9 states and is set up to support essentially good EM&V in the region, with goals of consistency and standardization, transparency, and sharing of information, as we're talking about here. They're set up that they have a steering committee that guides their work, and some of their products are listed here on this slide in the 4th bullet here. They've been around for quite a few years. They got their start when some regional energy organizations, regional public agency organizations through their organizations had resolutions, and they're funded with state dollars and utility dollars and some federal Department of Energy funds. And they in some ways take on all of the areas of collaboration that we mentioned as possibilities at the beginning of the presentation, the clearinghouse, the development of products, as well as they have a tracking system, all of which again is done on a voluntary basis. The 3 other examples I want to have are displayed here in this slide. The first is a informal, organized group that's facilitated by the U.S. EPA and the U.S. Department of Energy, and this is the State and Local Energy Efficiency Action Network, or C-Action. Some of you might be familiar with it. It's been operating for a number of years now, originally as NAPI, the National Action Plan for Energy Efficiency, and they have a number of working groups that work on topics relating to efficiency, residential, behavior programs, etc. And these groups have various products and reports and meetings and get together to share information and provide resources. One of these groups is actually the EM&V working group, and I've listed what their introductory line is for that group. It's basically to improve the credibility and timeliness of EM&V work. Just as an aside, the working group chairs for the EM&V group are both from the West here. One's with BPA and one is also with the Northwest Power and Planning Council, as is Tina. The next effort I want to mention is something that the U.S. Department of Energy has been operating for a couple years now. It's called the Uniform Methods Project, and they've been developing some EM&V protocols for specific energy efficiency as well as demand response type activities. And they have a collaboration effort where they have a technical committee and an advisory committee that reviews the protocols that are developed, and then they're published and made available to everybody. And then the last one I mentioned, some of you may have heard of, is NEAR, which is the National Energy Efficiency Registry. That doesn't exist yet. There's basically a number of organizations, including 6 U.S. states, including Oregon here in the West, that are working together to basically put together a scoping study of what such a national efficiency registry would look like, and that would be intended to allow states to track their own initiatives with respect to energy efficiency, but to do so in a standardized format. So that, just to sort of give you an idea of some of the other activities around the country that are related to what we're talking about. And with that, I want to turn to our next steps about what can happen next with this concept. And Elaine Ginocchio from WIEB will be talking about this. Elaine is an attorney and policy analyst with WIEB. She's located in Denver. She's the lead WIEB staff on the Idaho WIEB project, which is about multi-state Western collaboration on energy planning. And the focus of her current work at WIEB is on clean energy policies and regulations in general, all affecting the Western states, such as the Clean Power Plan. So with that, Elaine, if you could take it from there.
Hi, thanks so much, Stephen. Thank you for all the information you've imparted in the webinar. So yeah, again, I'm from the Western Interstate Energy Board. And as Steve or Lisa had said, it's a regional organization in the West that works on energy issues, primarily electricity. Our board's composed of members that are appointed by the governors of the Western states and Western Canadian provinces, and they're primarily directors of energy offices. We do much of our work through committees, and the committees bring together PUC commissioners and staff energy offices. It's been going on for decades. As of late, meaning the last few years, we've been working closely with air directors, and that came about since the announcement of the Clean Power Plan, where air offices and electricity offices have come together to address that. So we're fortunate that we're on a team working with Idaho that received a state implementation planning grant from the Department of Energy, the Office of Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy. One of the aspects of the project we're undertaking with this funding is to explore issues that could potentially benefit from interstate collaboration in the West. Early on in the process, through a stakeholder process, one of the areas identified was energy efficiency in EM&V. The focus at that time, and this project started in early 2015, was how it intersected with the Clean Power Plan compliance. Since that time, that's a little bit on the back burner. States are still very interested in getting information, but aren't putting pen to paper on plans because of the stay. But there are also a number of other advantages to coordination, which Steve and the other presenters have talked about here today. So we're fortunate to be able to have collaborated with LBNL on this work. It's an institution with an impressive amount of expertise and experience in EM&V. We have worked with them on helping them in terms of what kind of discussion paper would be helpful for our stakeholders in this effort, and they authored that discussion paper, which Steve had the link to. And it included both a lot of information about what the benefits of collaboration would be, as well as a number of strategies that could be taken to implement some sort of interstate, multi-state, regional coordination on EM&V. So the purpose of the webinar today was to, one, share this information with the stakeholders and interested parties, but it's also to get feedback on interest moving forward. And as Steve said, we've had a number of calls, a handful of calls with some state people about the paper as well as the clearinghouse idea, and got a very positive reaction to the clearinghouse. Just to give you an idea, if there was the interest in moving forward on this, there is potential for moving it forward. LBNL has graciously offered to discuss with DOE the possibility of funding, and WIEB, if requested by states, could continue to help develop it as well as managing a stakeholder process. This does not necessarily have to be the way it goes forward if there's interest, but it's just to give you a sense of there could be a way to move this forward. So at this point, what we'd really like from our stakeholders, the states, is to get feedback either today, you can either do it in the chat box, or after the webinar. And the kind of feedback we're interested in, I mean, you can give us feedback on anything you want on this topic, but just to focus it a little bit, if you have an interest in coordinating EM&V, what that interest is, and you've heard from a number of state folks about different interests that they have or different things they would get out of a clearinghouse, the thoughts about the clearinghouse idea itself, do you think it would or could have value to you or your state? And then interest you might have in providing feedback or guidance on what the clearinghouse would look like, the development of the project. So if you could provide feedback, again, you can do it in the chat box, or you can get in touch with me. Again, I'm Elaine Ginocchio. My contact information was on the announcement for the webinar. It's also on the last slide for the presentation. Or Steve Schneider, and his contact information is on the last slide of the presentation. Sometime, hopefully in the next 2 weeks, I mean, there's no cutoff date for your feedback, but I think the longer we get away from the webinar, the closer would be better, let's just put it that way. And in terms of if you want to share this information or you wanted to review any of this information, we're going to post the slides as well as the video and audio for the webinar on the WIEB web page. I will send out to everybody who got this announcement the link to that. If you didn't get the announcement, our URL is westernenergyboard.org, and it would be in the announcement section. So anyway, we have the timing here on the slide. This moving towards the clearinghouse would sort of be the next step beyond the project that we're working on with Idaho. We've put together so far the idea, the feedback, what states might think, what the challenges are, and so the timing for this would be have an exploratory group before this year ends in terms of could we get this going, what would that look like, do we like the idea of LBNL, discussing funding with DOE, and then early next year would really be the timeline for trying to actually get it put together. And this all, again, depends on the feedback we get from our stakeholders about what they think of this idea and what it might look like.
Great. Well, thank you, Elaine, for going through that. And as Elaine indicated, hopefully folks can get back to her with your feedback and what levels of interest you might have. Had a couple of questions come in asking about what information is available now around, available information, something that John had brought up during his talk about, finding access, where you can find, reports and similar, or even just contacts. And I know for myself that it's really, I'm not aware of such a common place of that. In California, there is a website, the CalMac website, that lists some of the, or most of the EM&V reports that have been associated with the evaluations of the investor-owned utility programs there. There's a contact list for consultants who work in EM&V. But this is part of the reason that we're thinking about doing some level of coordination here, is to try to create such lists in places of resources. Tina and I actually worked several years ago on a report for the Department of Energy talking about the value of just having a database of EM&V resources beyond the deemed savings, which I mentioned specifically before, and the unit energy savings as they're described in the RTF, but just having a common site where information on evaluation reports, such as if there was an evaluation of lighting programs, can you get access to similar lighting evaluation works? So unfortunately right now I'm not aware of any. I don't know if any of the other co-presenters here on the call know of a common place for such resources at this time. I did also get a note from one of our Canadian colleagues wondering if there's a role for the Canadian provinces. And I think that's probably to be determined. That's something we would need to discuss depending on the funding sources. And obviously with WIEB, there's collaboration with the provinces, and clearly, in this case with British Columbia, there's been a lot of great work that's going on up there, I'm sure in other provinces as well, that perhaps all of us can benefit from sharing. So I think that one's probably to be determined. I don't know if Elaine, if you have any particular thoughts on in coordination with our Canadian colleagues.
No, I think you covered that, and I think it would be a good idea since we're all in the Western interconnection. I don't know if there would be, the only glitch could potentially be if there's a funding source that complicates it, but short of that, it makes sense.
Great. Well, at this time, I'm not seeing additional questions come in, and we've reached about the 1 hour point or so. So with that, I think we'll conclude today's webinar. As Elaine mentioned, it's been recorded. The slides will be made available. And so I want to thank our presenters very much for really getting into this discussion and presenting their perspectives, and also that we seem to have a on-time webinar. So again, I want to thank everyone for their participation, and I wish you all a great rest of your day.
Thank you, Steve.
Thank you all.